I'll be taking you through Learning Unit 3, which is about the planning, designing, and presenting a CAPS lesson from the annual teaching plan, the use of teaching learning aids, including information communications technology. Now I will be working according to the learning unit that is on your landing page for this module. Of course, you know you will be writing a course from Monday till the 1st of June on this learning unit. Now, just to give you some background on lesson planning and the CAPS issues for FET economics, we must remember that the lesson plan is the most important intervention to achieve lesson objectives. In other words, you must ensure that your learners understand basic economic concepts and basic economic reasoning. Right? Then it is important that we teach FET economics as a discipline and not mere conglomeration of facts. In order to do this, we need to follow the CAPS or the ATP for grade 10 and 11. And here I must warn you, especially those of you that will be teaching grade 12, you must be careful when it comes to the ATP for grade 12 for terms 3 and 4, because the ATP makes provision for the order of work in terms 3 and terms 4. And normally we only have about 3 weeks in term 3 to complete all the work for the year. So in grade 12, we need to be ahead of the ATP. So you can't follow the ATP slavishly in grade 12. So please be aware of that. The next slide is then the planning that must go into the design of an economics lesson. Now, as I said before, the lesson is the heartbeat of all teaching activities. The lesson, in other words, what you are going to bring across to the learners. If you are going to discuss poverty, it comes to the fore in your teaching activity. Therefore, it is important that when you design the lesson, it must be carefully planned, because this will essentially determine whether the learners understand and whether they are on top of the material that you teach them. So therefore, in the lesson plan, the aims and objectives of the lesson plan are the most important part of teaching. You know that you have to write out a lesson plan, so the aims and objectives thereof are the most important parts of it. Right? What do I wish to achieve with the lesson? How are we going to do it? What is the teacher's role in the lesson? How much subject matter are we going to deal with? Which educational aids are we going to use? That is all part of the aims and objectives of the lesson plan. Right? Now, to bring the lesson plan effectively across, you must be aware that effective teaching is an art that encompasses the intellectual, the moral, and emotional components. Right? Intellectual, moral, and emotional components. Then the characteristics of successful teachers. In order for you to be a successful teacher, you must have authority. You must be in charge of the class in terms of your management as well as in terms of your knowledge and skills. You must have tenacity. The learners are going to try and frustrate you. But despite that, you must show them that you are going ahead with what you've planned for the day. You must also have compassion for those learners that are struggling. And then, importantly, you must have patience, right? Those are some of the characteristics of a successful economics teacher. Now, the lesson that you present flows from the CAPS economics curriculum and the annual teaching plan. So you have your CAPS curriculum, which is a separate document from the annual teaching plan, which is another separate document. But the annual teaching plan is based on the CAPS document, but it is more refined, it is more detailed. It tells you exactly where you should go with your lesson for every week and therefore for every day. But the ATP is not divided into days. It is divided into weeks. Now, when you want to be a successful economics teacher, when it comes to the lesson, there's two aspects which you need to consider in respect of subject matter when preparing a lesson. And that is the reduction of the subject matter. Remember, the topic of unemployment or whichever topic is very broad and it contains a lot of subject content. So you need to reduce that. So that is why we talk of the reduction of subject matter and the statement of the problem when preparing an economic lesson. Learners are usually unconcerned with the themes in the syllabus identified by the teacher. The main concern is that they have to master the content for examination and assessment purposes. Therefore, teaching is not necessary to deal with a problem in every lesson. Sometimes it takes 3 or 4 periods to solve a problem. But what is important for you is to know that you must consider the reduction of subject matter and the statement of a problem when preparing an economics lesson. The next slide is about the basic lesson design and the annual teaching plan. Right? In the previous slide, we looked at lesson planning. Now that we know what we need to do in order to plan a lesson, how do we go about designing the lesson? Now, the teacher needs to understand the basic forms of learning when it comes to the lesson design. Now, how can you ensure that learning takes place? It basically takes place through the following forms of learning, namely discussion, play, assignments, and exemplification. The latter is inherent, that is, exemplification is inherent in teaching, where you show a learner something that must be applied somewhere else. For example, a parent will show a child an example of a poisonous berry and warn him or her not to eat it. In this way, the subject matter becomes real. A visit to a car assembly plant reveals the advantages of specialization at that particular plant. But the advantages apply in principle to all industries and to all sectors of the economy. So you need to know the basic forms of learning. Right? Then the methodological principle which you will use to bring the lesson across. You must ask yourself, the teacher will determine if he or her must proceed inductively or deductively. Now, what is the difference between the two? The essence of induction is to start with a specific empirical fact, which on closer scrutiny leads to the establishment of a general concept. All right, so you move from the specific to the general. Deductive the child is led, or the student is led to apply general principles to several data and come to the right conclusion. So with the deductive, we move from the general to the specific. The economics teacher must take the above principles into account when using the ATP. Now, the ATP is an example of advanced planning, which is a prerequisite for successful teaching. You cannot be a successful teacher if you do not plan ahead. You cannot come to class unprepared. You are going to get caught out, and the children or the learners will lose respect for you. So to be a professional that's on the top of his or her game, you need to plan in advance, and you plan in advance through lesson planning. Now you are being assisted by the Department of Basic Education in this regard, because they draw up, or the provincial departments normally send out to the schools an ATP, which is in accordance with CAPS, and it normally follows a logical sequence in which it is to be taught. Right? The ATP is a prescriptive document. In other words, you cannot deviate from the ATP. All teachers must follow it. Although South Africa is a democratic country, when it comes to the ATP is dictatorial. In other words, you must follow in week 1. If the ATP says you must do this, you must do it. In week 2, you must do this, you must do it. So when a learner changes school, it is not difficult for that learner to catch up when he gets to the other school. Right? Now, the ATP, why was it introduced? In the previous assessment, in assessment 2, I've asked you to refer to an article, Plan Outpaces the Learners and Teachers, which dealt with the reasons why the DBE introduced the ATP and gives proper grounding to any teacher on the ATP. Now, a lot of people or educationists are not happy with the ATP because the ATP is very content driven, and it sort of doesn't make provision for slower learners. Slower learners, you need to catch up with them through additional learning activities after school or Saturdays or whatever the case might be. Because the Department of Education's only interest is that all the content that was prescribed must be completed. And as an employee of the department, you are expected to stick to that. And that article gives you the reasons why the DBE introduced the ATP. And it will be good for you to go through that article, because you might get a question on it again in assessment 6 if you haven't done any one of the other assignments. But very importantly, although the ATP is compulsory to follow in terms of content, you must cover the content that is in the ATP. CAPS make provision for a lesson to deviate from a fixed structure without sacrificing its principles. Right? So you don't have to teach according to a specific lesson plan, or specifically as to how it is stated in the CAPS document, as long as you bring what is in the ATP across to the learners. Now you must study paragraph 3.3 in your learning unit for more detail. Remember, students, you are going to do a quiz in assessment 3. And in order to answer a quiz, you need to go through your material, your learning material, as well as through these videos. Listen and re-listen to it again, because you guys have not been doing well in the assessment number 1. So you need to go through it on your own as well. It is not enough for only to go through these slides, because these slides is just a summary and it doesn't cover everything. Now, what is important for you as an educator is that you need to understand the didactical, or how to teach didactics, the didactical principles to use for economics lesson preparation. And that you will find in paragraph 3.4 of your learning unit. Now, what are the principles in short? You have the traditional principles of teaching economics or any subject. Here we make use of the learner's prior knowledge. We proceed from the simplex to the complex. We proceed from the concrete to the abstract, and then proceeding from the whole to the components and back to the whole. So you need to read through your course carefully if you get such a question. You must make sure that you don't answer incorrectly. Perhaps it is stated there in the course, the second principle under traditional principles, or the second step is proceeding from the complex to the simple. Now, teaching doesn't work that way. We always start at the simple and then we go to the complex. Sorry. Proceeding from the concrete and then to the abstract. The concrete is poverty. Where does it lead to? That is the abstract. It causes a lot of social problems, etc. Right? Then another principle that you must be aware of as an economics teacher is that the principle of totality. The totality of the teacher, the learner, and the subject matter. For example, a learner should be seen as a unit, in total. Right? A learner, although intellect is of crucial importance at school, other dimensions such as the affective and psychomotor should not be neglected. Head and heart should all be involved. So the principle of totality says we must not only look at the learner in terms of his intellect, how clever he is, but we need to look at the learner as a whole. And if we understand the learner as a whole, we will then convey our subject matter accordingly, and the learner will learn better. Another principle is the principle of differentiation. Now, what is this principle? Each learner is different from the other one. Each learner should be encouraged to perform to the best of his or her ability. And this principle of differentiation is also called the principle of individualization, can be linked to the next principle, which is the principle of activity. What is this? Very important, as the name implies. The learner must be active in class. Learning takes place only when there's active participation on the part of the learner. It is not enough for the learner to listen attentively. Something is wrong if your learners are sitting very quietly in your class and you present the lesson and you feel so good afterwards, but there was no input from the learner. In other words, they weren't active. You must worry about that if that happens in your class, because sometimes the learners, I've experienced it, that the learners sleep in front of you with open eyes. Right. Another important didactical principle is the principle of motivation. Now, in order to achieve success, learners should not only be ready to learn, but also motivated to do so. Therefore, the question, how can I motivate learners to study, requires careful thought on the part of the teachers. And we must be able to distinguish between intrinsic motivation, learners wanting to do well by themselves, and extrinsic motivation. That is where reward and punishment comes in. Now, we would want our learners more to have intrinsic motivation. It must come from within for them to learn. Unfortunately, in a school, we don't have that idealistic situation. And we must make use of extrinsic motivation, is whereby you reward learners for doing well, or you punish them if they don't do well. In other words, you keep them in after break or something to that effect. The last principle is the principle of perception. Perception is how the learners experience the class. Now, perception refer to all five senses, not only to the faculty of sight. Right? Refer to all five senses. And this is actualized. In other words, it is helped on by means of teaching learning aids. In other words, the learners can see and they can hear. Here, thought plays a role, and thought needs language for expression. Often one hears of someone looking but not seeing, listening but not hearing. But we need to practice these principles. So you need to go through all these principles, and there's a lot of them in the quiz. The traditional principle will always be there, no matter whether we apply the other principles as well. But you need to know where does it all start when it comes to didactical principles for the learning of economics. Prior knowledge, proceeding from the simple to the complex, proceeding from the concrete to the abstract, that is scaffolding, proceeding from the whole to the components, and back to the whole. Then the principle of totality, we need to see the learner as a unit. Also, the principle of differentiation. Principle of differentiation tells us that we must acknowledge that not all learners are the same, and that they are all different and they learn differently. Unfortunately, because the ATP is so loaded, you don't always have time for this differentiation. So you need to find time elsewhere to apply it. Very important principle for teacher, for learner-centered learning, is the principle of activity, where the learners are actively involved in their learning. And then the principle of motivation. Intrinsic motivation, learners want to do well by themselves. And then extrinsic motivation, where the question of reward and punishment comes to the fore. If you do not achieve 40% in this test, you will have to come back and do it again after school. And they don't like that. And we hope that through such punishment, they will try to do well and not be punished again. And then lastly, in teaching, we must realize that if we can apply all five senses to the learning space, the learner can only benefit from them. It is not good enough just for you to talk, but you should make use of teacher learning aids. And that is the next slide is dealing with that. No, not the last slide is dealing with teacher learning aids. Now, how can we bring the lesson across? What types of lessons do we get? Now, there are three basic types of lesson. The first one is the informative lesson. This is suited to any lesson or theme. It involves a transfer of knowledge from the teacher who possesses the knowledge and skills to the learners. In other words, when you start off any topic of economics, you start off with the information lesson. Secondly, we have the drill lesson. The drill lesson is repeating, inculcation and consolidation by means of repetition. But here we must, although it is repetition, it is important that learners should practice and understand. Right? For example, sometimes certain essay questions, you expect it to be set again in a specific exam. So you drill that question with the learners. But it helps if the learners also understand what they are learning. And some sections of the work need more drilling than others, especially in microeconomics. All those graphs of microeconomics, you go through it over and over, you repeat it, you ask the learners to come and repeat it. In that way, they will hopefully get a better understanding of the subject content. Then the revision lesson. Learners should know in advance which lessons or themes are to be revised so that they can take part in question and answer sections. From my experience, this lesson can also at times make you very disheartened. Because if you start to revise, you will find out that you as the teacher is the only one that is talking. There is little learner involvement. That makes you realize that the learners are waiting for the night before the exams to try and cover the content. That is why it is important that at the end of a theme, of a lesson theme, that you revise it. And before you start a new theme, you revise the previous section of the work. Revision lessons for assessments is very important. And as I said, don't get disheartened. As we said before in the first or the second slide, we as teachers, we must have tenacity. Even if we discover that when we do revision that the learners know very little, it mustn't break our spirit. We should just shoulder on. Then, for these lesson types, whether you are giving an informative lesson, the drill lesson, or a revision lesson, it is important that you write out a lesson. You cannot plan a lesson by just reading through your textbook. You must write out a lesson plan. You know, when you do practice teaching, it is expected of you to send a lesson plan to your supervisor that will come and assist you. So you need to write out a lesson plan which gives concrete expression to the teacher's reflection on didactic situation. There is no fixed recipe for a successful lesson. You can't follow the way your mentor teacher has conducted a lesson and think that and you thought that it was a good lesson, and now you try to replicate what the mentor teacher has done. Right? There's no fixed recipe for a successful lesson. It differs from person to person, and it differs between lesson to lesson. A teacher's individuality is visible in his or her style of teaching. But the reason why we write out a lesson plan is to force student teachers to review their teaching practice critically. Now, if you've gone through your learning unit, you will know that I've given you an example of the UNISA lesson plan. But that doesn't mean that you must use that lesson plan as it is. But whatever lesson plan you follow must more or less be in accordance with what is being suggested. That is why it is important to consider the following in any lesson plan. Localizing details is point number 1. In other words, what are you teaching economics? For which grade? What is the time allocated for this lesson? How many learners were in the class? What is the theme in the syllabus? Right? Then the reduction in the subject matter must indicate how you are going to reduce the subject matter. Then what is the lesson objectives or the learning objectives and the teaching objectives? Then a very important part of the lesson plan is the lesson pattern. Now the lesson pattern consists of 6 subcomponents, which is firstly the actualization of existing knowledge. Here you must make learners aware of how incomplete their knowledge is. They should be able to experience and also to express the problem that is taking shape. Then stating the problem. The next one is the exposition of new subject matter. Here the aim is to reveal aspects of reality presented in the new material. The teacher should not be in too much of a hurry, but should carefully plan the appropriate moment for his or her exposition of the new subject matter. Judicious use of teaching learning aids can enhance this effect. We'll talk about teaching learning aids shortly. Then we need to assess the absorption of new subject matter. Then functionalization is the 5th component. Here it implies that the learners make it their own. They acquire deeper comprehension, and it is a quest for better achievement. And the last point to consider under the lesson pattern is the question of assessment. Remember, we always need to assess in some way or the other whatever what you have taught. Did the learners learn anything? And the best way to determine that is to assess them. Assessment doesn't always mean a big test or a big an exam. It can be questions, short questions that you ask them, or ask them to come to the board and explain to the rest of the class a concept or a graph. Through those are all types of assessment. So, as I said, I've given you a UNISA lesson template that you may use. I've asked you in assessment 2 to refer to the lesson pattern. Point number 1, the actualization of existing knowledge, what is meant through it. You might get a question again, as I said, in assessment 6. If you haven't done one of these other assessments, assessments 1 to 5, then you must do assessment 6 in order to have a complete mark at the end of the year. The last topic that we need to look at in this module is the question of teaching learning aids. Now, it is important that you must remember that these aids can never replace the teacher. Nothing can replace the teacher. Right? Teaching aids are merely a means to assist the teacher. Now, what are teaching aids? You get traditional teaching aids, and you get technological and social media teaching aids. Now, the traditional aids, teaching aids, was during my time, we only had the chalkboard, the textbooks, charts, pictures, posters, maps, flashcards, worksheets, crossword puzzles, etc. Technological aids are the interactive whiteboard. And we refer to technological also as non-social media aids. Ne? The two are close, but we must distinguish between the two. So the technological aids is the interactive whiteboard, the Microsoft PowerPoint program, computer tablet, a smartphone, the teacher management system. Here at UNISA, the teacher management system that we use is the Moodle. Teaching apps, videos, etc. Remember, you cannot come to class and just play a video for the learners and think that you have conducted a lesson. That is only supposed to be an aid, but it can never replace you. If it replaces you, then you must resign. Get out of the classroom. You are not worth your salt as a teacher, because this must only assist you. The social media aids is blogs, Wikipedias, Facebook, Twitter, and podcasting. You need to go through that learning unit and the material that is being prescribed there on the social media aids. Now, the value of teacher learning aids. What is its value? It is there in learning unit 3. It's supposed to motivate the learners. It is supposed to help with the retention of information. It illustrates and elucidate abstract concepts and relationship, generate interest and reinforce the spoken words. Right? Then also it contributes to the meaningful progress of a lesson, well-prepared PowerPoint presentation, questionnaires, notes, and the like can be very valuable during the actual presentation. Another value add is learner involvement. It draws learners into the lesson, as they not only have to rely on the spoken word, but they can use all other senses. Then better provision for the learning needs of individuals. Modern teaching aids can be used to serve the needs of differentiated learners. Stimulation of learning experience. Various strategies can be used to advance the learning experience, such as smartphones, teaching apps, teaching learning systems, videos, visits to business, etc. But despite the value of these teaching aids, as I said, teachers should guard against the excessive and ineffective use of teaching aids. Right? It should never become a source of relaxation whereby the learners know when they get to the economics class, they're just going to watch a video. Then we've lost the plot. And we need to ask ourselves, do we still want to be teachers? Also, the guidelines in the learning unit that should be considered in the selection of teaching aids, you should go through that. The choice of a teaching learning aid relates directly to the expected activity of teaching and learning. Meaningful observation or actual experience should be the desired effect by external observation as well as internal feeling. In other words, the teacher should strive for balance between cognitive and affective moments. Then the next bullet says you must study the links you will find in your learning unit on using technology in the classroom, using digital tools to transform your classroom, and the advantages of technology. Those are videos that you must listen to, right? It will help you to form a holistic picture of the use of teaching learning aids. Then the other link is a link on information and communications technology and social media. That is a piece of reading that comes from a book written by Professor Van Wyk and Professor Dos Reis, right? And there we look at the educational values of wikis, blogs, Facebook, WhatsApp, etc. And you as learners, I mean you as students, you need to study this. You won't be able to answer questions in your course on the value of these wikis, blogs, Facebook, WhatsApp, etc. if you do not go through this particular link. Right, ladies and gentlemen, basically, this is what this learning unit 3 is about. The unit started with a lesson flowing from the CAPS for economics, where we said the ATP is also found in the CAPS. The provincial education departments provide schools with more updated ATPs every year. The didactical principles to impart a lesson and the types of lessons we then looked after. And it was recounted that the lesson is at the heartbeat of teaching. The lesson, which starts with lesson planning. A lesson is going to determine, ladies and gentlemen, whether a learner wants to be in class or not. It is the teacher's job to see to it that the lesson objectives are achieved through the lesson plan. The teacher must therefore be well informed of what is expected of him or her. Then we looked at the basic lesson design and the actual writing out of a lesson plan. You can never give up on this, and it must be done every day as a teacher. It's very important for a student to prepare him or herself in putting a lesson plan together. UNISA provides its own lesson plan templates that can be used. Then we looked at the teaching aids, both traditional and those impacted by ICT and social media, which is assisting the lesson plan. And I said you need to go through those links. After presenting the lesson plan in totality with teaching aids, the next step in the educational process is assessment, which we will study in learning unit 4. But this brings us to the conclusion of learning unit 3. And I hope that these slides and your material in your learning units in Moodle will help you to complete assessment 3 with success and much better than you have completed the first course assignment number 1. Remember, people, when it comes to quizzes, detail is important. Detail is important. You need to go through all the material that you have at your best. I therefore thank you for listening and following, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.